In the previous video, we looked at using an open file dialog control to allow the user to choose which files they wanted to open in an application. And there are several other dialogs available in Visual Basic. In this video, we're going to look at 3 of them, and that being the FontDialog, the ColorDialog, and the SaveFileDialog. So what I've created here in Visual Basic is a rich text format editor, and the user can enter text into this rich text box. They can select text and be able to change the font using the font dialog, which I've added to the application. They can change the color of the selected text by using the color dialog, and then they can save that file out either as a rich text file or as a text file without formatting using the Save File dialog. Let me just run the application so we can watch this execute. So I can select text in the editor. Of course, I can edit the text as well in here, or type in new text. I can clear it and add new text. I'm going to select this text, and I'm going to click the Set Font Attributes of selected text. Let's just make it bold. We'll make it a little bit larger. I could change the font, and click OK. And I can also change the color of that selected text. We don't see it selected, but it still is. And I could change the color. Just make it red. Let's do the same thing to this text here. I'm going to just simply set the color, and we'll make this blue. So I can modify the text using both the font dialog and the color dialog. And I'm going to save that text out. I'm going to click the Save RTF File button. It brings up the Save RTF File dialog, or the Save File dialog. I gave it this title as part of its properties. And I give it a default name of myDocument.rtf. And by default, it opens in the C drive. And we'll look at those properties here in a minute. I'm going to go up to my documents, and I've got that folder for daily specials here. And we'll leave it named My Document. I'm going to click Save. And then if I go into that folder, here is the My Document that I just saved. I can right-click on it and open it with WordPad. And you can see the rich text formatting that's applied. Let's take a look at these dialogs. Here's the font dialog. There's not a lot we can necessarily need to do here in terms of properties, but I did set the default font to Calibri 11 point. Color dialog, I can set the default color if I wanted. I just left it as black, which is the default. And then here's our Save File dialog. It's basically the same thing as the Open File dialog, or functions the same way. We can add a default extension. I'm going to save my files primarily as rich text format, so I have a default extension of RTF. I can give it a default file name. I just named it myDocument.rtf. Here are those filters. Let me just expand this so you can see. So I have 2 pairs here. One is rich text format, and the second half of that pair is asterisk or star.rtf. And then I have text file as another option, and its extension is, or its filter is a star.txt. And I set the initial directory to my root drive of C. So my rich text box is named RTF Editor. This was btn set font, btn set color, and btn save file. Let's just look at the procedures for those 3 buttons. Here's my Set Font Attributes as Selected button, or btn set font, and they click on that. There is the code that it executes. Very, very simple. We simply show our font dialog, and then in the RTF editor, I can set the selection font. So it's going to be the font of the selected text, and I'm simply going to set it to whatever the font that the user has chosen in the font dialog. Now, as we saw with the Open File dialog, when I choose Show Dialog for the font dialog, it also pauses the execution. And so until the user closes that dialog box, this statement does not run. So once they close the dialog box, it will then take the font they've chosen and apply it to the selected font. Same thing with the color dialog. Very simple to use. I'm going to show the color dialog and then set the selection color, so the color of the selected text, that's the property. I'm going to set that to whatever color they chose in the color dialog. Very simple. And here is our save button. Now, of course, I added once again the system.io, so imported that in so we could use our stream writer. So when I click the save button within a try-catch structure, I'm going to have a string variable for my file name. I'm going to create a stream writer instance named SW. And then because I'm going to save this out as a RTF file, I'm going to make sure that the properties I set for the SaveFileDialog are appropriate for a rich text formatted file. So I'm setting the default extension to RTF. The filter index was 1, and interesting enough, the filter indexes begin counting with 1 rather than 0. And generally, indexes always start counting with 0. I think this goes back to a much older version, probably VB6, of the SaveFileDialog. And I set the file name to the default of myDocument.rtf. I'm going to show the dialog. Once the user has selected or entered a file name and selected their directory, their selection of file name is going to go into my variable called file name. I'm going to check to see if it's empty. In other words, I click cancel, in which case I'm going to exit the sub. Otherwise, we're going to create that file using file.createText. We're going to write the RTF property of the RTF editor text box out to write, and then we're going to close that file. If anything goes wrong, we're going to show a message box that we're unable to save the file. Now, I also added a couple other buttons here. One is to open the file. So if we want to open an RTF file that already exists, we can do that. We can also open a RTF file as text and see the code, the rich text formatting code. We can clear the text of the rich text box, and then we can save that file out as a TXT file rather than as a text file. Real briefly, we'll look at those. So here is where I'm opening the file. And nothing new that we didn't do in the previous video. We're using a stream reader, using the open file dialog to choose our file. And if they didn't select file, then we're going to exit. Otherwise, we're going to open that file. And the only difference here from using a text file is we're reading it and putting it into the RTF property. When we want to open it as a text file, it's pretty much the exact same code. The difference here is I'm going to put it into the text property of RTF editor rather than the RTF property. To clear the text, we're simply setting the RTF to nothing. And then to save it as a text file, same as we did before when we saved it as an RTF, we're going to create a stream writer. I'm going to set my default extension this time to TXT, which is the filter index 2. My default file name is myDocument.txt. We're going to show the dialog, get the file name, and put it into a variable called file name. If it's a null string, we're going to exit the sub. Otherwise, we're going to create our file. We're going to write the RTF code out, and then I'm going to close the document. And again, if something goes wrong, we'll bring up a message box. Let me run this one more time just to show you how the open file works. So I'm going to choose open file. I'm going to open an RTF file. And there's the RTF. If I wanted to open that as text, I can come back, choose it, and there it is showing as a text file with all of the RTF codes. And of course I can clear the text, and I could save that out as a text file. I'm not going to bother to do that because I don't want to overwrite my file. Here's the same project in CSharp. Let's take a look at the code for our font attributes button. Same as our VB, very simple. Just showing the dialog and then setting the selection font to the font of the FontDialog. And the same thing for the color, showing the color dialog and setting the selection color of our RTF editor to the color of the color dialog. The Save button, really functioning the exact same way as I did in VB. I did a little bit differently here in that rather than exiting the sub, I simply checked to see if the file name was not blank. As long as it was not blank, then we're going to go ahead and create the file and write the RTF property and close it. If it is blank, then that never executes. There's the code for our Open button. And of course, you can pause the video to examine this a little bit more closely. But in essence, we're using a stream reader here and setting a show dialog for the open file dialog like we did in the previous video. And as long as it's not blank, we're going to open that text and read it into the RTF property. If they want to open it as text, same thing, but we're going to read it into the text property. I do one other thing here, and this actually took place in the VB section as well. And that is, when I read in the text, I want to set the font to the default font of Calibri 11 point. And what I did was I created a little text box with that font with that font. And I'm simply setting the font of the RTF editor rich text box to the font of my text box named TXT default font. Quick little simple way of changing fonts rather than creating a font object and setting the font face and the font family and the font size. This I find works really well. And then I just simply set the visibility of that text box to false so it doesn't show up. Then of course to clear the text, we are simply setting the RTF property to a null string. And here's where we're saving the text out as a text file rather than an RTF file, setting the default extension to TXT, filter index to 2. My file name is mydocument.txt by default. And then we're writing out simply the text rather than the RTF.